The Black Rose McQueen. I wanted to give a shout out to Ring IQ Boxing, and remember to tune in to the motherfucking relay.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Crawford knows he can get it. I'm a very simple man when it comes to the fight world and doing business. You know what I mean? Be real. Send the contract. Watch me sign it.
But you're telling me that if Terrence Crawford and they would send a contract and say, we want Keith Thurman, if the financials are right, you'd be okay with it? You would do it?
Of course. There's no
next fight.
Next fight. I could debate on it if it's not exactly what I want, which is the Manny Pacquiao rematch. You know, there are good fights out there that are good fights to let me reinstate some form of dominance in the welterweight division and then go right into a Crawford or Spence. If I'm presented with both at the same time, I'll go Spence over Crawford.
You'd go Spence over Crawford.
Spence has priority over Crawford. At the end of the day, he has two belts. You know, he has more pull, more weight in the welterweight division. Terrence Crawford has done tremendous throughout his whole career. I'm still not a fan of the belt that he holds. So I'm more interested in the matchup and the fight itself over being champion of that sanctioning body. But at the end of the day, I love great fights. I love being champion of the world. So, if I'm presented with those kind of opportunities, I'm not going to hesitate. I'm not going to wait. I might take it. I might take it, right? What?
This is a development that I'm sure is going to have a lot of people talking, assuming that they're not talking already, as this is the first any of us have seen
so far
when it comes to Keith Thurman pursuing a fight with the likes of a Terrence Crawford. Got a lot of thoughts on this, so let's get right into it. I don't know how much I can believe Keith Thurman when it comes to this particular fight. I don't know how serious he is about locking horns with Terrence Crawford. However, given the circumstance, I could entertain the idea that maybe Keith's not just joshing. Maybe he's not just clout chasing. Maybe, just maybe, he's being serious. That even though, up until this point, we've never seen Keith Thurman talk about pursuing a fight with Terrence Crawford. We've seen Keith Thurman go as far as
rematching Danny,
talking about a second fight with a Danny Garcia or a rematch with Manny Pacquiao. That's what we've been seeing up until this point.
It is.
But if he's serious about this, if he's really being serious here and he wants that Crawford fight, yes, I can support that move. I can get behind that. But because this is the first we've seen, because this is the first we've heard of Keith Thurman pursuing a fight with a Crawford, one is left to wonder, why the change of heart all of a sudden? What changed Keith Thurman's mind? Well, I can think of a few reasons. I can. I mean, you'll notice that Keith Thurman is letting it be known that what he really wants is a rematch with Manny Pacquiao, and I'm sorry to say that he's not going to get that rematch.
No way.
Forget it.
It ain't happening.
You will also notice that Keith Thurman mentioned Errol Spence and how Errol Spence fight takes precedence over a Terrence Crawford fight, as Errol Spence is currently in possession of more world titles. He's in possession of more world titles, and let's be honest, Errol Spence's pay-per-view numbers are significantly better than Terrence Crawford's pay-per-view numbers. In that way, I can understand that train of thought, that if Keith Thurman were offered both a Spence fight or a Crawford fight, he'd go with the Spence fight.
I get it.
I understand that, and I am not against it. However, Errol Spence himself very recently stated that he's not interested in Keith Thurman.
Well, like, me and Al have discussions all the time, and I tell him, like, I really want to fight. The guys that I've been wanting to fight, I want to fight. So, hopefully, I'll fight Danny Garcia this year, next year, Pacquiao, maybe Keith Thurman, I don't know. Probably not. I don't really care about him anymore because he didn't give me an opportunity when I wanted it, so I don't care about fighting him.
So therein lies a dilemma for Keith, that while you might prioritize a Spence fight over a Crawford fight, you might not get it. Errol doesn't seem to want to waste any time on you, doesn't want nothing to do with you. He's not going to give you the opportunity that you didn't give him. Leaves Danny Garcia, who very recently Keith Thurman said he'd be open to having a second fight with, Except the problem is that Danny Garcia is currently the front runner for an Errol Spence fight. So that takes those two guys out of the equation. You might not get a fight with Errol, and you might not get a fight with Danny, because those two guys might be fighting each other once boxing resumes.
So who's that leave?
Sean Porter. Problem with the Sean Porter is, I haven't seen Keith Thurman talk about having a second fight with Sean, and even if he were talking about that kind of fight, it's not likely that a rematch between Keith and Sean would be staged as a pay-per-view in all the ways that a Crawford fight would be staged as a pay-per-view. Just as well, there wouldn't be a world title on the line, so it would be a bit of a high-risk, low-reward situation. There's no world title. It's not likely that rematch would be a pay-per-view. And lest we forget, this isn't really the Keith Thurman of old, the Keith Thurman who had a good fight with Sean, but was able to eke out a victory against a very physically aggressive and physically imposing opponent. This Keith Thurman languished against Josecito Lopez and lost his world title to a 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao. Needless to say, a physically arduous fight. Not a chess match, but a physically arduous fight with the likes of a Sean Porter.
I don't know.
Well, this time, Sean might actually get you. And for running those kinds of risks with a Sean Porter,
Again.
you might as well go in there with, and fight a Terrence Crawford, because at least with Crawford, it'll be a pay-per-view, and there will be a world title on the line. You'll get more attention for a Crawford fight for the WBO title than you would for a Sean Porter rematch and no title at all. You'd be running risks, but would those risks be worth it to lock horns with a Sean Porter for a second time? Something very similar is true of a Yordenis Ugas fight. It's similar in the sense that that would be a solid fight for Keith Thurman, yeah, because Yordenis Ugas is top 10 ranked in the division, but it is a high-risk, low-reward situation. A Thurman versus Ugas fight is not a pay-per-view. It's not a pay-per-view worthy matchup, even though it's a solid matchup between two of the best guys at the weight. But better still, Keith Thurman ain't gonna get the payday for fighting Ugas that he could get for fighting Terrence Crawford. Won't get to be on pay-per-view, and it won't be for a world title. Thus, it's a high-risk, low-reward situation, and at this point in Keith's career, I don't think that's what he's looking for.
Nah.
I don't think he's looking for high risks and low rewards. Perhaps this is the reason that we're seeing a change of heart from Keith Thurman. That for the first time, he's actually talking about fighting Terrence Crawford as opposed to who Terrence Crawford has been fighting. Perhaps this is the reason we are seeing this change of heart. That is one scenario that could help explain what we're seeing here. However, another scenario might be that Keith Thurman is leveraging himself and what his next move is to get what he wants from Al Heyman and from Tim Smith. That if you guys aren't going to put me in a cushy financial situation, I will go as far as putting myself in one. What do I mean by this? You guys remember when Mikey Garcia approached Vasyl Lomachenko and Egis Klimas personally, face to face? And it came from him, not Vasyl Lomachenko, that those two guys should orchestrate a pay-per-view between them. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Do you remember how shortly after that, it went about being from Mikey Garcia versus Vasyl Lomachenko to Mikey Garcia versus Errol Spence? I mean, did you guys notice that? One could have interpreted that situation as Mikey Garcia leveraging himself as talent to get what he wants from the people at the PBC. That I want to be on a pay-per-view, and if you guys aren't going to put me in one, I'll find a way to get there on my own. It's always been my interpretation of Mikey Garcia's change of heart when it came to Vasyl Lomachenko, that all that needed to be done was to make the fight, as both guys were world champions in the lightweight division. And out of nowhere, Mikey Garcia had a change of heart. He changed his tune. He decided to dare to be great against Errol Spence, where not that long ago it was about Mikey and Loma. It became about Mikey and Spence. This situation with Keith Thurman, him potentially crossing the street for a Terrence Crawford fight, provided that Crawford can send him a contract, Crawford's people. This situation might be like that situation, to where maybe Keith Thurman doesn't really mean business, but he's using himself as leverage to get what he wants. Get what he wants from Al Heyman, get what he wants from Tim Smith and the people over there at the PBC. As We heard Gary Russell not that long ago say something very similar
About Santa Cruz.
about the Leo Santa Cruz fight. I mean, we heard Gary Russell say something along the lines of, if he doesn't get that Leo Santa Cruz fight, he's going to cross over to the top-ranked side of things and see about getting a fight with Miguel Berchelt. Now, Gary didn't follow up on that, but better still, you'll notice that he used himself as leverage
Bargaining chip.
to get what he wants. He used himself, and he used what his next move could have been as leverage to try and get what he wanted. Ultimately, he didn't get it now, did he?
No, he didn't.
He didn't follow up either.
No, he didn't.
But that move from Gary Russell could be a parallel for what we're seeing here with Keith Thurman. Perhaps Keith Thurman is using himself as his own bargaining chip to get what he wants from Tim Smith, from Al Heyman, from the people over there at the PBC, that maybe all of this is just a clever bluff. But it's not that he's bluffing the people over there at Top Rank or Terrence Crawford. He's bluffing his own guys on his own side of the street to get what he wants. So you can believe Keith Thurman as there is reason to believe him, or you cannot believe Keith Thurman as there is reason to not believe him. It's all up to you what you want to believe.
It is.
I'll tell you, I look at Keith Thurman, and if I'm not 100% sold, I'm not 100% convinced that Keith Thurman means business, it's because of the look in his eyes. You know, he doesn't have the blank stare that a fighter who's got fire in his belly might have. The kind of fighter who might have suffered a couple of ups, couple of downs, couple of setbacks, but he's still got that competitive spirit, that fire in his belly to where he believes in himself, and at minimum, he'll go in there with anybody and give anybody hell. That is not the impression Keith Thurman leaves me with. You know, the look in his eyes is the look of a guy who feels forgotten, feels abandoned, feels like a shadow of his former self, perhaps unappreciated, and is perhaps wrestling with himself internally to try to become something like the fighter that he used to be. Tap into his former self, which may prove fleeting over time as the competitive fire in his belly has been all but extinguished due to all these different stints of inactivity that Keith Thurman has suffered over the years. I mean, at the pinnacle of his career, at the height of his success, this guy was gone for something like 2 years due to frequent injuries and things like that. I mean, how many times was Keith Thurman's return postponed from the time he beat Danny Garcia? Those kinds of situations, they can kill your competitive spirit. They can kill your drive. They can wipe away your memory of the fighter that you used to be because you got too comfortable over time. And this is a young man's sport, and you're not always going to be a young man. I look at the look in the eyes of Keith Thurman, and I don't see the blank stare of a competitor. What I see is a guy who's just leveraging the situation based on circumstances as opposed to competitive drive and hunger, wanting to be better than who else and what else is out there. I don't see that on Keith. I just see a guy who's reflected on what options are available for him, and that's pretty much all he's doing at this point. I mean, Keith Thurman only has one professional loss. Those are the facts. And one professional loss doesn't have to be the end of the world. But whether or not you can bounce back from it has everything to do with your internal health and your psychological makeup. Your psychological, internal, intestinal fortitude. And at minimum, if nothing else, Keith Thurman has been an injury-prone fighter for the last, 3-4 years. That kind of stuff. It can kill what momentum you're trying to build. It can kill your competitive drive. And once that goes, it doesn't really matter how good a physical specimen you are.
Or aren't.
You gotta want to be there. Reiterate, boxing is not a punch in the clock, go through the motions kind of job. You gotta want to be there in the camps, preparing for who you're gonna be fighting. You gotta want to be in that ring with that guy opposite the ring of you. You gotta want to take that guy out. You gotta want to move on from that. This is the kind of mindset, the kind of headspace that you gotta be in. And I don't look at Keith Thurman and see that kind of guy. I just see a guy who's looking for the lesser of two evils while still trying to make a profit. It's just that his methodology of making a profit involves going in there against somebody that might be hungrier than you are at this point. Because at minimum, if you're talking about a Terrence Crawford, I've no doubts that Terrence Crawford is itching to get his hands on a PBC fighter to make an example of that PBC fighter, to make a statement against that PBC fighter to the rest of the PBC's fighters, namely Errol Spence.
That's what Crawford's trying to do.
I think that Keith Thurman is approaching most every situation these days, from the Lopez fight to the Pacquiao pay-per-view to what could be a Crawford pay-per-view. I think he's approaching most every situation these days half-hearted, disillusioned, and half-hearted. And that's not the kind of headspace you want to be in against a guy like Terence Crawford. At minimum, I think Keith Thurman possesses certain tools to make the fight interesting. But Keith Thurman, even at his best, never struck me as the most durable of welterweights. I've never viewed Keith Thurman as being a guy who takes the best punch. I mean, a lot was made of the famous body shot that Luis Collazo landed on Keith Thurman. A lot was made of that, as Keith Thurman was visibly hurt by that. Very recently, a lot was made of Manny Pacquiao scoring that knockdown. But before that, very early in Keith's career, he was knocked down by the likes of a Quandre Robertson. You think about these different instances, and then you think of Keith as a physical specimen and how injury-prone this fighter has been over the years. It becomes apparent that with Keith Thurman, it's never been a question of what can Keith Thurman take, as he is a fighter who has been visibly hurt several times. It's not, nor has it ever been, a question of what Keith can take, so much as what can Keith get out of the way of. We saw Manny Pacquiao, who fights out of the southpaw stance, double up on his jab and follow up with a very hard shot that dropped Keith Thurman, as Keith Thurman was moving backwards and looked to be a straight line. Just so happens that Terence Crawford is a very fluid fighter out of the southpaw stance. As we all know, Terence Crawford is a switch hitter. He's just as good out of the orthodox stance as he is the southpaw stance, though many times he does start off as a southpaw. The southpaw stance. The same southpaw stance that Manny Pacquiao fights out of, although there are some obvious differences. Better still, the angles that stance afforded Manny Pacquiao are the exact same angles that it affords a Terence Crawford, who is a bigger, younger, fresher fighter in peak physical condition, whereas the same can not be said of Keith. I mean, Keith's still got a good set of legs, good-sized punch, though he doesn't take the best punch.
Not really.
I could very much see Terence Crawford hurting Keith Thurman to the body out of the southpaw stance, then switching off to orthodox and following up with big right hands. And I'm not convinced Keith can weather those shots from a Terence Crawford the way he did from an aged Manny Pacquiao or a veteran Luis Collazo. In all likelihood, I'd pick Crawford to stop Keith Thurman. You know, these are just preliminary talks. We don't know if this fight is or isn't going to come off. But if it does, I would go with Terence Crawford to stop Keith Thurman, which begs the question, is Keith Thurman really serious? Or is this all just some kind of publicity stunt? We'll find out one way or another.